I didn't expect my life to split in two because of one sentence I said at the end of a long day. I got fired today. I said it quietly, not to test anyone, but because I needed to see what would happen next. What I overheard minutes later wasn't anger or fear. It was relief, calculation, a door opening I didn't know existed. If you've ever stayed silent too long in the name of family, you might recognize what came after. That morning in Atlanta moved the way it always did. Emails stacked up before sunrise, meetings booked back to back, the kind that required closed doors and careful language. I'd been doing this long enough to know which conversations mattered and which ones were just noise. At the logistics firm, my title carried weight. People waited for my approval. Mistakes landed on my desk. I didn't mind that part. Responsibility had a shape I recognized. By late afternoon, a restructuring memo circulated. Nothing unusual. Large companies shed skin every quarter. I skimmed it, flagged a few lines, forwarded notes to my team, and kept going. Years in management teach you not to flinch at corporate theater. You do your work, protect your people when you can, and keep moving. At home, the air felt different, not tense, just thinner. My wife sat at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone, shoulders slumped as if she'd been carrying something all day. She asked about the meetings, then about the budget, then about next year. The questions came closer together than usual, less curious and more pointed. I answered in short sentences, chose neutral words, let a few things pass without comment. Silence had become a habit, useful, or so I thought, for keeping the peace. Dinner came and went. Plates were cleared without much conversation. She rubbed her temples, sighed, mentioned her parents again. There was always something needing attention, a bill, a favor, a plan that required my signature later. I nodded where it seemed harmless. I didn't ask what she needed this time. The sentence slipped out as we stood near the doorway. "They're cutting positions," I said. "I got fired today." No drama, no build-up, just a fact, delivered the same way I'd deliver weather. I wasn't testing her, not consciously. I wanted to see what the room would do with it. Sometimes truth shows itself when you don't chase it. She froze for half a second, then nodded, asked one question, what severance looked like, and turned away. There was no anger, no panic, not even the worry people put on when they know they're supposed to feel it. She said she needed to take a call and stepped into the living room. I grabbed my keys and jacket. The day had been long. Fresh air sounded useful. As I crossed the hallway, her voice carried through the doorway. Soft, controlled, a voice she didn't use with me much anymore. "It finally happened," she said. I slowed without meaning to, stopped near the stairs. She laughed, quiet, quick, and the sound landed wrong. Not relief exactly, something sharper. "No, he doesn't know yet," she continued. "We'll have room now, yeah, we can move forward." There was talk of timing, of accounts, of what could be done before anything got messy. Names came up I didn't recognize. My job became a detail, a solved problem, not a concern. She wasn't worried about me. She was rearranging pieces. I took another step, then another, careful not to make noise. The conversation rolled on, calm and efficient. When it ended, she thanked the person on the other end and promised to call back later. Outside, the evening air hit my face. The garage light flickered on. I stood there longer than I needed to, keys cold in my hand, listening to the house settle behind me. For years, I'd believed silence was a kind of protection, that absorbing discomfort kept other people safe, that if I didn't push, things would stay intact. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in. Silence hadn't been neutral. It had been permission. I got in the car and sat without starting the engine. My phone buzzed with a work notification. Another email, another task. Habit urged me to respond. I didn't. Instead, I replayed the call in my head. The ease in her voice, the way my absence from the equation simplified everything. Driving through the neighborhood, I noticed how ordinary everything looked. Porch lights, people walking dogs, lives unfolding without drama. The road led nowhere special. I circled a few blocks, then parked again, this time by a small strip mall I'd passed 100 times without seeing. I wasn't angry, not yet. Shock hadn't settled into shape. What I felt was smaller and heavier, a sense of being misplaced in my own life. Years of steady effort, of covering gaps, of staying quiet when lines blurred, and here was the result. My fall treated like a convenience. Back home, she was on the couch, phone down, television murmuring. Asked if I wanted tea. I said no. She smiled, relieved, as if a crisis had been averted. We sat in the same room, watching different things, sharing nothing. Later, as I set my alarm for the morning, my mind kept working through practicalities. Accounts, documents, timelines. The stoic part of me took over, cataloging facts without emotion. There would be time for that later, I told myself. For now, I needed to stay clear. When sleep didn't come, I stared at the ceiling and counted breaths. Tomorrow would look the same from the outside. Meetings, calls, plans. Inside, something had shifted. The quiet I'd relied on had crossed a line, and stepping back into it felt impossible. The next morning didn't wait for me to catch up. Messages started coming in before I finished my coffee. Not from work, from family. A cousin asked if everything was okay. An uncle offered to put in a word somewhere. By noon, a friend from church texted about a lead he'd heard through someone else. The story had traveled faster than I expected, stripped of context, padded with concern. I hadn't told anyone. That part was clear. At home, my wife moved through the day with purpose. She called her parents early, voice low but steady, then spoke to a few people I didn't know by name. When she talked about me, it sounded like a summary, not a conversation. He's taking some time. We're figuring things out. The words landed as decisions already made. I let it happen. Old habit. Intervening felt messy, and I told myself it would settle on its own. Silence, again, seemed easier than correcting every version of the story floating around. By afternoon, the pity became heavier. People meant well, but every suggestion carried an assumption that I'd lost footing, that I needed rescuing, that I should explain myself. None of them asked what actually happened. They asked what I was going to do now. Work continued as usual. Calls still came in. Projects still needed attention. My title hadn't evaporated overnight, no matter what anyone believed. Keeping that line intact mattered, so I kept my voice even and my schedule full. At some point, I noticed my wife answering questions I hadn't heard yet. She'd preempt calls, explain plans, assure people we were aligned. When a neighbor asked me directly about the rumors, she stepped in before I could respond, smiled, smoothed it over, said we'd talk later. Later never came. That evening, I drove across town to meet an old colleague for coffee. We'd worked together years back, before he shifted into legal consulting. The place was quiet, neutral, good for short conversations. No catching up, no sympathy. He listened while I spoke in fragments, careful not to accuse, careful not to exaggerate. He didn't interrupt, didn't lean in with concern. When I finished, he asked one question. What do you still control? It took a moment to answer. Income streams, for now. Access to my accounts, my name, at least on paper. He nodded, as if checking items off an invisible list. Hold on to that, he said. Don't volunteer anything you don't have to, and don't assume people will wait for you to clarify. We talked 10 more minutes, nothing dramatic, no instructions, just a reminder that facts move slower than narratives, and silence doesn't stop either. Driving home, traffic crawled. I watched brake lights and thought about how easily my role had been reassigned without me present. Decisions were being made in my absence, using my quiet as consent. The realization didn't sting so much as it weighed. Years of being reliable had taught people to expect compliance. At the house, my wife was already on another call. This time, she didn't lower her voice, mentioned timelines, used phrases like temporary setback and shared responsibilities. I walked past without comment and set my bag down. Dinner felt procedural. She asked if I'd heard back from anyone. I said no. She suggested a few options I hadn't requested. Her tone stayed helpful, measured, as if managing a project rather than a marriage. Later, while she showered, I scrolled through my phone. More messages, more offers, a few quiet questions I didn't answer. I wasn't ready to explain anything, not because I lacked answers, but because speaking too early would lock me into a version of events I hadn't verified. That night, sleep came in short stretches. Between them, my mind sorted details. Who knew what? Who spoke for whom? Which boundaries had shifted without acknowledgement? I wasn't angry yet. Confusion still held the floor, but it was losing ground. Morning arrived with another round of calls. My wife had already left for errands. On the counter sat a note about meeting her parents later in the week. No time listed, no question mark. I stepped outside to take a call from work, voice steady, facts intact. When it ended, I stood there a moment longer, phone in hand, considering how quiet everything felt. Not peaceful, vacant. Inside, the house waited. Conversations had happened without me. Decisions were forming their own shape. The space where I used to stand felt occupied by assumptions, and I moved through it carefully, measuring each step, aware that whatever came next would not arrive on its own. The rumor reached me through a voice I didn't recognize, a number I almost ignored, a man who said we'd crossed paths once at a conference years ago. He didn't waste time. "People are saying your standing took a hit," he said, internally. No details, no accusation, just enough to unsettle what I'd been holding steady. I asked who was saying it. He deflected, apologized for calling, said he thought I should know. The line went quiet before I could press. I sat with that for a while, phone face down, letting the idea settle without reacting to it. Internally meant inside the company, the one place where facts mattered. I replayed the last weeks in my head, meetings attended, decisions signed, performance reviews still clean. Nothing lined up with the suggestion that my credibility had slipped. Still, the word lingered, like grit you can't quite rinse away. At home, access started to narrow. Not announced, not argued, just redirected. A bank notification came through with a setting I didn't remember changing. When I asked about it, my wife said she'd consolidated things to simplify. Another document arrived by email, already signed, something I usually handled myself. She said it was time sensitive, that she'd taken care of it. Her parents began calling more often, not to ask how I was doing, to discuss logistics, plans, what made sense given the circumstances. They spoke in plural, what we should do, then looked at her when decisions were needed. I stayed present, listened, nodded when it didn't cost me anything, and noted the moments when my input stopped being requested. Paperwork shifted locations. Files moved from the drawer in my office to a folder I didn't recognize. When I asked where something was, the answer came back casual, almost bored. "I've got it." So I started paying closer attention. At work, nothing had changed. That mattered. Calendars stayed full. Calls came through as usual. I signed off on shipments and compliance checks, approved budgets, solved the same problems I always had. No one questioned my authority. No one hinted at concern. The rumor didn't belong there, which meant it belonged somewhere else. Evenings became quieter. Not peaceful, just managed. Conversations took on a transactional tone. When I spoke, responses stayed agreeable, brief. Decisions had already been discussed elsewhere. I didn't challenge that, not yet. Instead, I watched how information flowed around me and where it stopped. One night, while my wife talked with her parents in the other room, I opened my laptop and began pulling records. Email threads first, nothing dramatic, then account histories. Dates didn't line up the way I expected. Transfers clustered around days I'd been traveling. Permissions adjusted without alerts. Small moves that made sense on their own, less so together. I saved copies, backed them up to a drive I kept at work, changed a few passwords quietly. Not as a declaration, just maintenance. I turned off a shared calendar sync that had been used to speak for me. If someone wanted to claim my time, they'd have to ask. The house kept moving. Dinner, laundry, plans for the weekend. She mentioned a meeting with a financial advisor I hadn't scheduled. I asked for the name. She gave it to me, surprised, then recovered. Said she'd loop me in later. Later became a pattern. Another call came in from the industry. This time, a woman I'd worked with more recently. Her tone stayed professional, but cautious. She asked if I was still the right contact for a project. I said yes. She hesitated, then said she'd heard conflicting things. I asked what kind. She changed the subject. After we hung up, I stared at the screen and thought about how stories travel when they're carried by people who think they're helping. No malice required, just momentum. At home, a document appeared on the counter with a sticky note asking for my signature. I read it carefully. The language had shifted responsibility without saying so outright. I didn't sign. Set it aside. No comment. My wife noticed later, picked it up, asked if I'd had a chance to look. I said I was still reviewing it. She watched me for a moment longer than usual, then nodded and took it back to the office. That night, I copied another set of records. Transaction logs this time. Screenshots, timestamps. I didn't feel clever doing it, just thorough. Years in management teach you how quickly narratives harden once they're written down. If facts were going to matter, they'd need to be preserved early. Sleep came late, not from worry, but from calculation. I thought about where authority actually lived, in access, in signatures, in whose version got told first. The familiar order had started to crack, not with noise, but with quiet substitutions. Morning brought the same routine: coffee, emails, a call from work that required immediate attention. I took it from the driveway, voice steady, notes open. When it ended, I looked back at the house. Curtains drawn. Movement inside I couldn't see. I went to the office anyway, sat through meetings, made decisions, laughed at the right moments. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, pieces no longer matched the picture they claimed to form. By the time I got home that evening, the printer had been used. Fresh pages sat stacked, already clipped. I recognized the formatting. I picked them up, skimmed the first page, and set them back down where I found them, then reached for my phone to save another file before dinner. We were already late when we arrived in Houston. Her parents' place was full, voices overlapping, plates moving from hand to hand. No one asked about the drive. Someone mentioned traffic, another joked about flights. I took a seat near the end of the table and let the room settle. Conversation drifted the way it always did at these gatherings. Small updates, surface laughter, familiar complaints. Then my wife cleared her throat and stood, not formally, just enough to draw attention. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "So, with everything going on," she said, "we've had to rethink some of the bigger decisions. Since he's not working right now, it makes sense for me to handle them." The word "not working" hung there, heavier than the rest. A few heads turned toward me. Someone nodded, slow and sympathetic. Her father leaned back in his chair, hands folded, as if the matter had already been discussed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her. I said I was still employed and that we were reviewing options. The sentence stayed short, factual, easy to ignore. She smiled and moved on, explaining what would happen next, which expenses needed attention, which plans were being postponed. The room accepted it, not because they believed her more than me, but because she spoke first, and with certainty. My silence from earlier weeks had trained them well. After dinner, people broke into smaller conversations. Her mother asked if I needed anything. Her cousin mentioned a job lead. No one asked why decisions had been reassigned. The assumption had already been absorbed. I stepped outside to take a call from work. It was brief, routine. When I returned, my wife was showing documents on her phone to her parents, gesturing toward figures I recognized. I waited for a pause that never came, then excused myself and sat back down. The drive back to Atlanta started late. We spoke about neutral things: weather, the kids, the road. Nothing about what had been said. I didn't push. The timing felt wrong, and something else had begun to press at the edges of my attention. By the time we crossed state lines, a notification came through from the bank. Not an alert I'd set, but one tied to a shared asset. I opened it without comment. The message was brief, technical, the kind that assumes consent has already been given. A property we owned together had been used as collateral. I asked when that happened. She kept her eyes on the road and said it had been handled earlier in the week. "Necessary," she explained. "Temporary, just until things stabilized." The words arrived smoothly, as if rehearsed. I asked who authorized it. She said we had talked about it. I said we hadn't. She corrected herself. Maybe not explicitly, but it was implied, given the situation. The conversation ended there, not in resolution, just exhaustion. At home, I sat at the table and pulled up the records. Dates, signatures, a legal structure that allowed the move without my direct approval, using language broad enough to stretch. It was clean, technically valid, ethically thin. That was the first real loss. Not abstract, not emotional. Something measurable had shifted hands without my agreement. The realization sharpened my focus more than anger ever could. The next day, messages followed. Her parents wanted updates. A family friend asked if I'd seen the paperwork. Someone mentioned how responsible she was being under pressure. Each comment carried the same undertone. This was no longer my lane. At work, nothing mirrored the chaos. Meetings stayed on track. My authority held. The contrast was almost disorienting. Respected in one place, quietly displaced in another. That evening, I requested copies of all recent financial documents. She said she'd send them later. I said I needed them now. She hesitated, then agreed. The delay told me more than the words. When the files came through, I reviewed them slowly, cross-checked terms, noted patterns. This wasn't panic-driven behavior. It was planned. Small steps taken early, now paying off. I didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation would invite a performance, and I didn't need one. What I needed was clarity. Over the next few days, I adjusted my routines. Calls taken privately, files stored off-site, conversations documented. I stopped sharing timelines. If someone asked about plans, I said I was evaluating options, no more. Another notification arrived midweek. Not a new loss, but confirmation of the first. I saved it and closed the app. Dinner waited. She talked about upcoming appointments, asked if I'd be available. I said I'd let her know. That night, after she went to bed, I sat in the living room with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it. I listed what had changed and what hadn't. Access, authority, narrative. The pattern was clear enough to follow. The drive to work the next morning felt longer than usual. Traffic moved the same, but my attention stayed inward. Defensive habits wouldn't hold against something this deliberate. Staying quiet had bought time, but it had also cost ground. At a red light, I forwarded a folder of documents to a secure address and deleted the sent confirmation. The light turned green. I merged back into the lane and kept going, already thinking through the next call I needed to make before the day filled itself up. The email arrived in the middle of a work call. No subject line. A personal address I rarely used anymore. I didn't open it right away. Finished the conversation, took notes, agreed on next steps. Only after the line went quiet did I click. 3 attachments, PDFs, clean scans. The first page carried my name in a familiar font, the kind I'd signed 1,000 times. The problem was simple. I hadn't signed any of them. I scrolled slowly. Dates matched the weeks I'd been traveling. The language was tight, professional, written to survive scrutiny. Whoever prepared these knew exactly how much authority my signature implied, and how to borrow it without raising alarms. There was no message body, no explanation, just the files. I didn't forward them, didn't reply. Saved copies, then printed one page and slid it into my bag before heading home. That evening, my wife was already fielding calls. I heard my name used carefully, framed as a concern rather than a presence. She spoke about stress, about pressure, about how hard it had been managing things alone. The story positioned her as steady and me as absent, overwhelmed, temporarily unreliable. No one asked for my version. They didn't need it. Hers was coherent enough. After dinner, I stepped outside and called the colleague I'd met earlier, the one who'd asked what I still controlled. He listened without interruption as I described the documents, the timing, the way decisions had been rerouted around me. When I finished, he paused. "This isn't a domestic disagreement," he said. "It's an acquisition, slow and quiet." The word landed cleanly. No drama, no outrage, just accuracy. He asked where the documents came from. I said I didn't know. He said it didn't matter yet. What mattered was preserving everything and not tipping my hand. If someone was willing to impersonate my authority, confrontation would only accelerate the damage. "Decide what you're protecting," he added, "then move accordingly." Inside, my wife had finished her calls. She asked if I was okay. I said I was tired. That answer seemed to satisfy her. She talked about an upcoming meeting with people who knew my name but hadn't spoken to me directly in weeks. I listened, nodded, asked one neutral question about timing. She answered easily. Later, in bed, I stared at the ceiling and ran through options. Staying quiet had kept things calm on the surface. It had also allowed a structure to form without me inside it. Challenging it outright would trigger a counter-narrative I wasn't prepared to fight yet. Morning came with another round of messages. Her parents wanted reassurance. A mutual acquaintance reached out to ask if I needed help transitioning. Someone at work forwarded a note asking whether a project should still come through me or be redirected. I answered the work message first. Short, clear, still the point of contact. Then I locked down access to a few accounts, nothing dramatic, just removing permissions that had been granted too broadly. I notified the bank of discrepancies without assigning blame, requested audits, paperwork, not accusations. At lunch, another email arrived from the same anonymous address. No attachments this time, just a sentence. You should check what's been filed in Harris County. I didn't respond. Instead, I searched public records during a break between meetings. It took less time than I expected. Filings under my name linked to transactions I'd never approved. All legal. All positioned to look like continuity rather than fraud. The scope was wider than I'd realized. That afternoon, my wife sent a group message outlining next steps for the family. She included me, but addressed the room. Her language implied consensus where none existed. She volunteered to take the lead. Several people thanked her. I didn't reply. By evening, the choice I'd been circling tightened into focus. I could let this continue, preserve a thin version of peace, and hope the structure collapsed under its own weight. Or I could reclaim authority deliberately, with facts and timing on my side. I chose the second, without announcing it. The next call went to a firm recommended by my colleague. Not to file anything, just to understand exposure. The conversation stayed technical, unemotional. I asked about options, not outcomes, took notes, scheduled a follow-up. At home, my wife noticed the shift, asked if something was wrong. I said I was reorganizing a few things. She smiled, relieved, and went back to her phone. That night, I organized documents into folders labeled by date and type. Transactions, communications, public filings. Each piece told a small part of the same story. None of it required imagination, only attention. I backed everything up twice. Once to a drive I kept at work, once to an account she didn't know existed. Before shutting the laptop, I drafted a short email to myself, summarizing what I'd learned so far. No adjectives, no conclusions, just facts, in sequence. Down the hall, the shower turned on. Water ran. I closed the file and stood, slipping the printed page back into my bag. Tomorrow would look ordinary enough. Meetings, calls, shared meals. The difference was internal now. I wasn't waiting for clarity anymore. I was building it, piece by piece, while the house settled into its usual rhythm. Work absorbed me in a way it hadn't for weeks. Not as an escape, but as structure. Tasks arrived, decisions followed, outcomes landed where they should. Between calls, I pulled records and matched them against what I already had. Dates aligned, amounts repeated, patterns emerged without forcing them. Bank statements came first. I compared monthly flows against the period when permissions changed. Small withdrawals clustered around days I'd been away. Larger movements appeared just after family meetings. None of it screamed theft. It read like coordination. Next came contract histories, versions saved under different names, clauses adjusted by a few words, enough to shift authority without setting off alarms. I highlighted changes, noted who'd sent what, when. The work felt familiar. This was how problems were solved at the company, methodically, without raising your voice. Emotion settled into the background, not gone, just managed. When anger tried to surface, I redirected it into checklists. When doubt crept in, I verified another source. The process didn't ask how I felt. It asked whether something could be proven. At lunch, I met with my colleague again. No cafe this time. We sat in a conference room borrowed from someone he knew. I laid out what I'd found. He didn't comment until I finished. "They've been careful," he said, "but careful leaves trails." He advised me to keep everything parallel. Never rely on a single copy. Never centralize access. He also warned me not to rush. People who think they're in control tend to overreach when pressed. That afternoon, a text arrived from an unknown number. Just my name and a question mark. I didn't respond. 10 minutes later, another message followed, asking if I was available to talk. The tone stayed casual, but the timing felt off. I blocked the number and saved the messages. At home, my wife watched me more closely than before, asked where I'd been, commented on my schedule. I answered plainly, nothing extra. When she suggested reviewing finances together, I said we'd schedule it. Not no, not now. Documents continued to circulate without my initiation. Some arrived for signature, others for awareness. I read each one, returned a few with neutral questions, let the rest sit. Silence, used correctly, could slow things down. Midweek, I noticed a car idling longer than usual outside the office lot as I walked to mine. Could have been coincidence. The next day, the same car appeared near my neighborhood. Different time, same plate. I memorized it without reacting. Another email came in from the anonymous address. No warning this time, just a screenshot of a calendar invite I hadn't seen, scheduling a meeting under my name. The location matched a firm my wife had mentioned in passing. I forwarded it to my colleague and archived the message. By then, I'd built a working timeline. What started as help had shifted into substitution. Decisions made on my behalf, authority borrowed, narrative adjusted to justify it all. The strategy depended on my reluctance to disrupt appearances. At work, I requested a routine audit on projects tied to my name. Nothing accusatory, just process. The request went through without resistance. Another confirmation that, in this space, my standing remained intact. Evenings stayed quiet. Dinner, brief updates, a show neither of us watched closely. She mentioned how stressful everything had been. I agreed. Stress was the one thing we still shared language for. Later, I reviewed phone records. Calls placed while I'd been in meetings. Contacts repeated more often than chance would suggest. I noted them and moved on. One night, the doorbell rang after 9. A delivery I hadn't ordered. The driver handed me a package addressed to my full legal name. Inside were copies of documents I already had. Printed, annotated. Whoever sent them wanted me to know I wasn't the only one paying attention. I didn't bring the package inside, took photos, resealed it, and placed it back by the door. In the morning, it was gone. Sleep came easier than before, not because things had improved, but because uncertainty had narrowed. There were limits now, known quantities. The work ahead was defined. The next day, a meeting invitation appeared on my calendar, added by someone else. I declined it without comment and blocked the sender. An hour later, my wife asked why I'd canceled. I said I hadn't agreed to it in the first place. She frowned, then smoothed it over. Traffic moved slowly on the way home. I dictated notes into my phone, short and factual. Dates, names, actions. The car with the familiar plate passed once, then disappeared into another lane. At the house, I set my bag down and went through the mail. Bills, flyers, an envelope from the bank, addressed jointly. I opened it, scanned the contents, and placed it on my side of the desk before heading to the kitchen to start dinner, already sorting which calls needed to happen tomorrow and which could wait until the ground shifted just enough to make them matter. Not by certified mail, not announced. Just a thick envelope mixed in with routine correspondence. My name typed neatly on the front. I opened it standing at the counter, skimmed the header, then sat down because my legs stopped cooperating. A civil complaint. Filed under her name. Framed as protection, necessity, urgency. The story inside bore only a passing resemblance to the life I'd been living. I was described as unstable, unreliable, financially reckless after losing my job. Decisions she'd made without me were recast as emergency measures. My silence was translated into absence. I read it twice, slowly the second time. Not because I hoped it would change, but because accuracy mattered now more than reaction. Old memories surfaced without warning. Another kitchen, years ago. Another ending I'd sworn wouldn't repeat itself. Back then, I'd left quietly, believing distance would spare everyone the damage. I remembered the look on my child's face when routines changed without explanation. The promise I'd made to myself afterward, to never let things dissolve without clarity again. That promise sat with me as I turned the pages. The legal language did its work efficiently. Temporary orders requested, access restricted, assets frozen pending review. The goal wasn't to win outright. It was to pin me in place while momentum did the rest. My phone buzzed. A message from my wife, short and carefully worded, asking if I'd seen the filing. I didn't respond. Another followed, explaining how hard this was for her, how she'd had no choice. I set the phone face down and finished reading. Work didn't pause. A meeting started in 20 minutes. I showered, dressed, drove in, took my seat, spoke when needed. No one noticed anything off. The room functioned on outcomes, not backstories. During a break, I stepped into a quiet corner and called my colleague. He'd already heard. These things move fast when filings go public. "She escalated," he said, "which means she thinks she's ahead." He asked if I wanted to respond immediately. I said no. He agreed. Reaction would feed the version she'd already released. We discussed next steps in terms that stayed procedural. Deadlines, jurisdiction, evidence, nothing personal. After work, I picked up my child. The drive home stayed quiet. School updates, a question about dinner, the normal cadence. At a stoplight, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the expression. Focused, closed, holding. At home, my wife wasn't there. A note on the table said she'd be back late. The house felt larger without her voice filling it. I cooked, helped with homework, tucked my child in. Routine steadied me in a way nothing else could. Once the door closed, I returned to the documents, compared claims to records, highlighted inconsistencies, dates that contradicted travel logs, decisions attributed to me that occurred while I was in meetings with witnesses. The story held together emotionally, but it fractured under scrutiny. Messages stacked up. Her parents, a mutual friend, someone from church asking if everything was okay. I didn't answer. Each reply would require context, and context was now a legal instrument. Later, she came home, tired, composed, asked if we could talk. I said tomorrow, not out of spite, out of necessity. Conversations held at the wrong moment become exhibits. Sleep didn't come easily, not from panic but from noise. Thoughts overlapping, planning, anticipating. I wrote notes in the dark on my phone, brief and factual. Each point anchored me to something verifiable. The next morning, another envelope waited. Temporary orders granted. Not unexpected, still a blow. The language restricted movement in subtle ways, required approvals, introduced supervision where none had existed. The intention was clear. Constrain, then define. I felt the edge then, not despair, pressure. The sense that one more passive step would lock everything into place. At lunch, I met my colleague again. He'd brought copies of filings I hadn't seen yet. We spread them out on the table and worked through them line by line. No raised voices, no outrage, just gaps. "She overreached here," he said, tapping a paragraph. "And here." I nodded. Overreach leaves fingerprints. We outlined a response, not a counterattack, a correction. Requests for discovery, motions grounded in discrepancy, not emotion. He asked if I was ready for the fallout. I said I didn't have a choice. Back at work, I informed HR of a pending personal matter that might surface publicly. No details, just enough to preempt confusion. The conversation stayed professional, supportive even. Another reminder that, in this arena, credibility still held. That evening, my wife tried again. Her tone shifted between concern and frustration. She said we were making things worse by dragging this out. I said nothing, listened, let her finish. When she asked if I understood, I said yes. When she asked if I agreed, I said no. Dinner sat untouched between us. Afterward, I gathered the documents I'd been organizing for weeks and placed them into a single folder. Labeled it by date, slid it into my bag. Tomorrow, it would go to the attorney formally. No more preparation. The process would move on its own terms now. Before bed, I checked on my child again. A blanket adjusted, a light turned off. In that quiet, the decision settled fully, not dramatic, not loud, just firm. In the morning, I set the alarm earlier than usual. There were filings to submit, calls to make, routines to keep intact. As the house stirred awake, I poured coffee, opened my laptop, and began attaching exhibits, letting the day pick up where the work required it to. The call came during a gap between meetings. A number from out of state, unfamiliar but persistent. I stepped into an empty office and answered. He introduced himself by name, then by role. Years ago, he'd handled internal records at my company, compliance, filings, the kind of work that stayed invisible unless something went wrong. He said he'd found my contact through someone mutual and wanted to be careful with his words. "I saw your name used in a way that didn't make sense," he said. "Thought you should know." We met later that day, not in person, but over a secure line he insisted on using. His voice stayed measured, professional. He explained that there had been inquiries tied to my employment status, requests framed as verification. The timing stood out. They'd come from outside channels, routed through third parties connected to my wife's family. They wanted confirmation you'd been terminated, he said. "We didn't provide that because it wasn't true." The story they'd been pushing relied on a single assumption, that my job loss was real. With it, urgency followed, emergency decisions, temporary authority. Without it, the justification thinned. He described how someone had tried to align dates, suggesting a restructuring announcement meant dismissal, implying internal reprimands that never occurred. None of it held up to records. Still, the narrative had been persuasive enough to move quickly through informal channels. I asked if anything official had been altered. He said no, not internally. But he'd noticed documents circulating externally that referenced internal processes inaccurately. Enough to look plausible to outsiders, not enough to survive audit. Before we ended the call, he sent over copies of correspondence he was permitted to share. Sanitized, redacted where necessary, still clear enough to connect dots. I forwarded everything to my attorney and saved backups where I'd been saving everything else. Then I sat quietly and let the sequence arrange itself. The termination story hadn't been an accident. It had been a lever. At home, my wife continued as if momentum favored her. She spoke confidently to anyone who asked. Her filings leaned into emotional language, stress, instability, concern for the family. She framed my restraint as distance. My refusal to engage publicly became evidence of disengagement. When I asked for clarification on a detail she'd cited in a message thread, she accused me of nitpicking, said this wasn't the time for technicalities. The response confirmed what the witness had already shown me. The story worked only if no one slowed it down. I didn't correct her, not yet. I kept collecting. Signatures came next. I laid them out in order. Documents she'd signed, documents bearing my name, dates stamped within hours of calls I'd been on elsewhere. One signature appeared twice, identical down to the pressure mark, on documents supposedly signed days apart. Another referenced an authorization that hadn't existed at the time. The pattern wasn't just control, it was haste. Her advantage stayed visible on the surface. Temporary orders remained in place. Conversations around me assumed her version was the safer one. People spoke carefully, as if afraid I might break. She let that stand. Privately, the structure weakened. I requested discovery formally, narrow at first, specific records, time-limited, enough to require her to produce originals rather than summaries. The request went out without commentary, no accusations attached. Her response came fast and loud, motions to dismiss, claims of harassment, emails to mutual contacts warning them I was trying to intimidate her. The escalation confirmed what my colleague had predicted. Pressure would draw overreach. Another message arrived from the witness, this one brief. He'd been asked to clarify his earlier position by someone connected to her family. He declined, logged the attempt, offered to testify if needed. That was the piece I'd been waiting for. I spent the evening assembling a clean timeline. Nothing speculative, just events in order. Employment records, travel logs, transaction timestamps, filings, communications. When placed side by side, the contradictions didn't need explanation. Dinner passed quietly. She spoke about schedules. I responded with neutral confirmations. When she mentioned a meeting scheduled under my name later in the week, I said I wouldn't be attending. She asked why. I said it hadn't been authorized. The look that crossed her face lasted only a moment. Then it disappeared behind practiced calm. Later, after she went to bed, I reviewed the packet one last time. No adjectives, no conclusions, just evidence arranged to speak for itself. The advantage had shifted, not because I'd outmaneuvered her, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand still long enough to be seen. In the morning, I sent the file to my attorney with a short note. This completes the record. Work called early. A situation needed immediate attention. I took the call, resolved it, delegated follow-up. Normal operations continued. Stability where it still existed mattered. By midday, my attorney confirmed receipt and scheduled the hearing that would bring everything into the open. No drama promised, just procedure. At home that evening, I gathered the documents I no longer needed to keep hidden and placed them on my side of the desk, not as a threat, as a signal that the quiet phase had ended. She noticed but said nothing. Made dinner, talked about plans that assumed cooperation. I listened, ate, cleaned my plate. When the dishes were done, I returned to the desk and added one final document to the folder. The correspondence confirming my employment status, dated weeks before any of this began. Then I closed the folder and set my alarm for the morning. already moving through the steps that would come next. The bank meeting was scheduled for 9. No urgency in the invitation, no warning tone, just a request to clarify outstanding matters tied to shared assets. I arrived early, checked in, sat where I was told. Papers were already arranged at the center of the table. She came in a few minutes later with her attorney. Calm, composed. The look suggested confidence rather than readiness. We exchanged brief acknowledgments and waited for the banker to begin. He spoke first, outlining the purpose of the meeting in neutral terms: verification, authority, risk exposure. Each item came with a document attached. When my name appeared, he looked to me. I confirmed. When her version followed, he nodded and moved on. Then the questions narrowed. Dates didn't line up. Authorizations referenced policies that hadn't existed at the time. One signature appeared twice, identical in a way signatures never are when they come from different days. The banker slid copies across the table, asking for clarification. Her attorney stepped in, framing explanations around stress, confusion, marital strain. I said nothing. When my turn came, I passed over the folder. No commentary, just records, employment verification, travel logs, email headers, public filings matched against internal confirmations. The room shifted without sound. Pages turned, pens paused. The banker asked a follow-up. I answered with a sentence, short, factual, enough. Her attorney objected to tone, not content, claimed context mattered, suggested the emotional environment explained the discrepancies. I didn't argue that either. Emotion wasn't the issue, authority was. By the end of the meeting, the outcome had changed shape. Collateral arrangements were suspended pending review, accounts flagged, further action deferred until legal clarity was established. No accusations were made, none were needed. We left separately. The law office came next. Smaller room, fewer people. The atmosphere there leaned procedural, not dramatic. My attorney laid out the response calmly, referencing the same timeline I'd built over weeks. Discovery requests aligned with the bank's findings. The witness statement was introduced without flourish. Her final move came then, not legal, emotional. She spoke directly to the room about fear, about pressure, about how she'd felt abandoned when I lost my job. She described carrying everything alone. The words were familiar, effective in other settings. They landed softly here, then dissolved when measured against records. No one interrupted her. When she finished, my attorney asked whether she disputed the dates. She said no. Asked whether she disputed the signatures. She hesitated, then said she didn't recall signing some of them herself. That pause did the rest. The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't lecture. He noted inconsistencies and ordered a temporary restructuring of access and responsibility. Accounts returned to joint oversight. Filings amended. Claims narrowed. The emotional allegations were set aside pending evidence. It wasn't a victory. It was correction. In the hallway afterward, she tried to speak to me, said we didn't need to do this, said I was making things harder than they needed to be. I listened without responding and kept walking. The distance between us felt earned, not dramatic. Outside, the day moved on. People passed without noticing. I checked my phone and returned a call from work, answered a question, approved a change. Life didn't pause for outcomes. Back at the house, I packed what I needed. Not everything, just enough. Documents went into a drawer that would stay locked. Keys placed where I could find them later. No scene, no speech. She watched from the doorway, arms folded, expression unreadable. Asked where I was going. I said I'd be staying elsewhere for a while. She said that wasn't necessary. I said it was. Dinner remained on the counter, untouched. I took a container, thanked her, and left. The drive was quiet, not empty, just unburdened. At the place I'd arranged earlier in the week, I set my bag down, plugged in my phone, and returned a few messages I'd ignored. One from my attorney confirming next steps. One from my colleague checking in. One from my child asking what time I'd be home tomorrow. I replied to the last one first. Later, I reviewed the orders again. Clear, measured, enough to hold. The truth hadn't needed emphasis, it had needed space. In the morning, I planned to return to work as usual, Meetings were already on the calendar. Deadlines remained. The path forward didn't require explanation. Before turning in, I set out clothes for the next day and placed the folder back into my bag. Not out of fear, out of habit. Then I turned off the light and lay down, already thinking through the routine ahead, letting the quiet settle without asking it to mean more than it did. The days after didn't rush me. Paperwork moved at its own pace. Orders took effect quietly. Access changed hands without announcements. I returned to work and kept my calendar intact. People there responded to results, not rumors. That stability mattered more than I expected. I met my attorney once more to finalize details. We reviewed outcomes, not grievances. Accounts were restructured, claims narrowed, timelines set. He asked if I wanted to pursue anything further. I said no. Enough had been corrected to allow me to move forward without carrying her story anymore. At home, what used to be home, I went back once to collect the rest of my things. Not everything, just what belonged to me without debate. Clothes, books, a few framed photos. I moved through the rooms without pausing. Each space held memories I didn't need to revisit to understand. She wasn't there. Her parents had come earlier that week to help. I'd heard they were asking questions now. Not of me, of her. The same people who'd spoken with certainty before had begun to hedge. Silence travels quickly when explanations stop working. My phone buzzed while I packed. A mutual friend, asking what really happened. I replied that the matter had been resolved legally, nothing more. The truth didn't require expansion. The hardest part wasn't anger or sadness. It was recognizing how easily I'd mistaken endurance for virtue. I'd believed holding things together was always the right move. That absorbing discomfort proved strength. It took losing ground to see the flaw in that logic. Trust, once misplaced, doesn't need punishment. It needs distance. I dropped the last box at the new place and set it by the wall. Unpacked slowly. Set up what I needed. Left the rest for another day. Routine reassembled itself piece by piece. Morning coffee, evening calls, homework at the table. The shape of life adjusted without commentary. Messages continued to arrive for a while. From her family, from people who wanted reassurance. I didn't respond. The system had already answered on my behalf. Facts had a way of closing conversations better than explanations. One afternoon, I received notice that a remaining claim had been withdrawn. No apology attached, no admission, just closure. I saved the document, then archived it with the rest. Work offered a new project soon after. Not as consolation, as recognition. I accepted without hesitation. The effort I'd redirected inward now had somewhere useful to go. My child adapted faster than I did. Kids often do. We settled into a new rhythm. Dinners became simpler, weekends lighter. Questions came and were answered honestly, without assigning blame. I didn't need to rewrite the past to protect the future. I ran into her once at a public place, briefly. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished, just exposed. We acknowledged each other with a nod. No words exchanged. The moment passed without weight. Later that evening, I thought about how much energy I'd spent trying to be understood. How little of it had been required once I stopped explaining. Control returned not through force, but through boundaries. The last administrative task arrived on a Friday, a final confirmation from the bank. Everything aligned. I signed, scanned, sent it back, closed the laptop and stepped away from the desk. Dinner was already on the stove. I stirred, tasted, adjusted seasoning. Ordinary actions. Grounding. The kind that don't ask you to prove anything. Afterward, I washed the dishes and set the alarm for the next day. Meetings were scheduled, plans in place. Nothing dramatic waiting on the other side of sleep. Before turning in, I checked the door, the lights, the quiet of the house. No tension humming under the surface. No need to brace for what might come next. I lay down and let the day end where it was supposed to. Without replay, without rehearsal. The work had been done. Not perfectly, just enough. Tomorrow would arrive on its own.